It's been 3 months since a surgeon removed a piece of my spine and replaced it with something that doesn't belong there. I'm still plagued by pain that stops me from doing the things that I love on occasion, and yet in Dungeons & Dragons, our players' characters can walk off dragon fire with a good night's sleep. If that bugs you and you're looking to add some lasting stakes and real risks, then you are in the right place. Today, we're going to talk about lingering injuries and give those stories some scars, or give some stories, whatever. Let's get to it. Before we get a chance to start talking about the problems inherent with lingering injuries and solutions to those problems, it's first important that in all of our games we ask why. In my experience, there's basically 5 reasons that people usually cite: realism, balance, immersion, depth, or consequences. If your goal in adding lingering injuries is to add realism to your game, then keep in mind that the stories that we're trying to tell are fantasy stories. When people watch the Avengers and they see somebody get thrown through a concrete wall, usually it doesn't occur to us that that would completely cripple any individual who hit it, or that the brick wall probably shouldn't actually be broken at all, but rather the person's body should just compact and sploosh all over the place and make a horrible mess. Action physics are not realistic in movies, and they shouldn't necessarily be super realistic in our Dungeons & Dragons games. A lot of the time, your players are not going to be looking for a realistic system. They will want verisimilitude. They will want to know that the things that they do make sense within the world that they are a part of, but they're not necessarily looking for that world to be this world. The second concern or focus of lingering injuries is that of balance, and it's important to realize that in the long term, lingering injuries aren't. In fact, if you take a look at any lingering injury table, there are some things that are so wildly out of balance there that they could potentially cripple one of your players to the point where their character is no longer worthwhile to play for them. So it's important that the system that we develop and that we do implement has enough balance to allow our play to continue enjoyably at the table while still meeting the other needs that we're interested in. When looking to use lingering injuries to add immersion, what we're really saying is that we want our players to focus in upon the situation that they are in, to modify their behavior because of their past experiences. Lingering injuries can serve that process, but only if we're paying close attention to them. It doesn't help that horrific scars are upon somebody's face if no NPC ever reacts to them. It is important for us to focus on immersion if we want our players to focus on immersion, but lingering injuries can aid in that as long as we're diligent. Adding consequences to action only works as a lingering injuries subset if there is some form of means of avoidance of the lingering injuries that's within the player's control, or if there's a means for the players to impact the system in some manner. It's not a consequence that becomes an enjoyable or interesting part of the game if it's something that just happens to you at some sort of random interval. After all, players that can't interact with the system and don't have any control over it don't feel like it's a consequence for the choices they make. Depending on your system, it could be as capricious as a dice being rolled and coming up 1 or 20, and that being the reason that you end up with a consequence for something completely outside your control. Closely tied to the idea of immersion and realism is the concept of depth. Whenever we add complication to our rule set, the goal should be to add as much depth to the stories that we're telling and to the system that we're running with as little complication as possible, because it doesn't add a lot of depth to the story or to our characters' stories if we're not constantly referring back to this lingering injury, and if the players don't have means of impacting the system either before, after, or both for the receipt of their grievous injury. But once we've worked out that it is worth our time to add lingering injuries to our specific table, we do still have a bunch of hurdles and problems that are in our path. The DMG presents some basic rules for including lingering injuries and introduces the first problem of frequency. According to the DMG, you could have lingering injuries appear when somebody gets to 0 hit points, or maybe when they fail a death save by 5, or it suggests it could happen every time somebody suffers a critical hit. If any of you are currently running a campaign in the mid tiers, you know that critical hits not only are a pretty frequent thing to happen, but sometimes can happen back to back, round to round, or multiple times in a single attack routine. The dice just don't lie. When multi-attack is making 3 attacks around and somebody's knocked your guy prone, then it can get pretty outrageous. Whereas if your lingering injury system is about avoiding people getting to 0 hit points, then you're working against the whack-a-mole healing style that 5th edition is becoming famous for. Likewise, if it's a failed death save, then you're waiting until the round following somebody being dropped down, which again decreases the frequency. These are all methods that can be used, but they have vast impact upon the game, and every single crit system is going to mean multiple times per session in some cases that you are applying these rules, and so you have to take that into account in the design. If you are using the failed death save by 5 system, then you start running into what one of my players called the Schrodinger's injury, where you don't actually know that you have an injury until you look at it later. You don't know when you get dropped down and the narration is the smack upside the head from the creature that knocks you unconscious, that your injury is actually going to be a broken leg. That breaks your narrative a little bit and makes it hard to figure things out, and is a common problem in lingering injury tables. The other, of course, is the interaction between the hit point system and the long rest system, where fighting vigor is restored every day, but many DMs consider your hit points to be a measure of your health instead of a measure of your willingness to fight. And if you are one of those that's talking about hit points being lost as injuries being gained, and then a night's rest miraculously restoring you to full fighting health and sealing all of those wounds, then the interaction between the deep cut that healed overnight and the scar that for some reason does not heal properly is a dissonance that needs to be overcome. Finally, one of the biggest problems with the lingering injury system is the idea of player motivation. I used to play Blood Bowl when I was a kid, a fantasy football game set in the Warhammer universe where essentially no holds were barred. And during the course of a campaign, you would accrue injuries to your players: concussions, broken ribs, missing legs, torn out eyes. And if you got enough of those on one of your players, they became essentially a detriment to put on the field. And so you sat them on the bench. But since you don't typically have the option to bench one of your player characters in favor of a separate character without it being a big problem at your game, then your lingering injury system can push towards that if it's too aggressive. So let's talk about a couple of solutions to the problems that have been presented. First up, on the matter of frequency. While I personally think that the drop to 0 or the failure on a death save of 5 or below are not terrible options for setting a reasonable chance of injuries occurring without it being a massive detriment to player motivation, it does run into the Schrodinger's injury problem much easier than does the critical hit rule. So an adjustment to the critical hit rule that'll allow you to know when the injury is going to happen before it has dropped somebody to the ground is to adopt the rules from a sword of sharpness. Whenever a critical hit is scored against an opponent or upon a player, then you roll another d20. If that d20 happens to rock up on another natural 20, then you have a critical injury that leaves a lasting mark. Another way to reduce the frequency and make critical hits more narrative is to use a called shot mechanic that requires somebody to actively seek to maim somebody. In my table, I use a system that requires you to take disadvantage on your attack rolls in order to hit the area of a creature specifically that you're trying to to target. If you do hit, then you deal damage as normal. If you've dealt enough damage to that specific limb, target, or part of the body, then it starts to trigger some kind of response. Typically, I allow my players to do things like target the massive stinger of a giant scorpion, and if they can deal a quarter of the hit points damage specifically to the stinger, then the stinger becomes non-operable, and they're no longer able to use the poison-based attack against the players for the rest of the fight. This is just a simple example of how it can be run, but a quarter, a third, or half of the creature's hit points are great thresholds in order to set this up. Or it could just be that anytime somebody specifically hits, that you roll on a table that has relatively light consequences and only a small chance of actually crippling that limb. The DMG has one of the best options for avoiding the loss of player motivation, and that's to, instead of creating a detailed table that does mechanical effects upon your player, to instead have descriptive effects that you give to players as an additional flaw for them to roleplay. They get to decide what kind of impact it's going to have on their choices and actions, but have no actual mechanical consequences, and instead simply have those narrative consequences. This allows them to lean in or lean out so that they can opt in or opt out to your lingering injuries, and it allows you to have another opportunity for them to enhance their roleplay by living in their character's situation, and hopefully for you to remember to give them inspiration when they do so, unless it's as rare for you as it is for me to remember to give it out. The only way to deal with the interaction between hit points and long rests is essentially to change how you narrate your battles. To realize that most attacks against hit points should probably not actually result in a player even being struck fully, but instead it's the wear and tear of blocking blows, of dodging out of the way, and of avoiding injury that is taking place when hit points are lost until they start to have some real and lasting consequences. If you switch to that sort of narration, then it'll allow you to make long rests make a little more sense and be a little less frustrating, as you realize that your long rests don't heal the wounds that you have. All your hit points represent is your willingness to fight, and that explains why some of those have more of that than others, when really the warrior should not actually have more hardiness and actual ability to be stabbed in the kidney than a wizard would. Finally, of course, there is the matter of an injuries table, however. The DMG has a fairly simple one, but I've included a link to my favorite down in the description of this video. It includes a couple of really novel concepts that allow you to interact magic and long rests into fixing really critical injuries, where you can spend X amount of time in order to recover from an injury fully, with that time being lessened by successful medicine checks. Or you can fix the same problem with magical healing to a set amount. As an example, if you were to break a leg, it might take a certain number of weeks for that to heal while you're hobbling with a lowered speed, but if you have medical assistance, then that time could be halved. Or you could have the cleric in your party continue to pump magical healing into that leg to fix that broken bone, and even though you only need 10, 11 hit points to get to your full hit points, it might take 50 hit points of magical healing specifically upon that wound in order to set the bone properly and fix your lingering injury. Every night you can use the remaining spell slots of your healing classes to pump healing into that busted limb. It becomes a focus of your downtime and an opportunity for roleplay, as well as a mechanical penalty that has a solution that could be interacted with by your players, to where they have some kind of say in the matter. No one of these options is the best option for lingering injuries. You're going to have to mix and match bits and pieces together to make the system that works best for you at your table. I know that for my players, that involves a fairly minimal chance of lingering injuries and some fun narrative focus upon them when they occur. At your table, that might be different. There is one campaign idea that I think lingering injuries would fit in particularly well, and that's a Monster Hunter campaign. Perhaps it could include a custom injury table for each of the specific monstrous beasts that you design, or you could include grizzled veteran NPCs that are showing off the kinds of wounds that were delivered to them while the research phase is ongoing. Check out this video here for details on how to make Monster Hunter quests exciting and interesting, or if you've already seen it, then check out over here for some more great advice. Either way, thanks for watching and happy adventuring.